Andy Lattal, it's very nice to have you here.
Thanks, Spencer. It's good to be here.
We want to ask you some questions about your personal history in behavior analysis.
Okay.
How did you become a behavior analyst?
I've been a behavior analyst, I think, since I was born. It just took me a while to figure it out. I first became interested in behavior analysis as an undergraduate at the University of Alabama. When I had decided to major in psychology, but didn't know what I wanted to do, and I took a course in comparative psychology with a guy named Steve Kendall. And it turned out that the course was a course in learning, which we didn't have at the University of Alabama in 1961. Or 63, I'm sorry. After taking that course, I asked Steve a couple of questions about experiments, and he then asked me if I'd like to work in his lab. And I handled my first pigeon in the spring semester of 1964. Oh, 63, I'm sorry. 1963. And I did an experiment on extinction, or not extinction, but fixed interval responding as a function of satiation. And after that, I've never put the pigeon down.
That's been your pet ever since.
Yeah, and then I decided, one thing led to another, and here I am. But it all started like it does for most of us with an interest in an undergraduate course.
Of the many people that I've talked to about their history, I think you're one of the few who have been absolutely consistent in your path. Your path has been very straight. You seem to, each thing leads to the next thing. There doesn't seem to be any discontinuities.
I believe in the inductive method, and I've kind of let my data be my guide through my whole career. I can probably tie every experiment that I've done back to the first one that I did in one fashion or another. But, I branch out from time to time and do something, but it always follows from things that I have done in the laboratory.
Like your work on the contingency, your conceptual work on the contingency.
Yeah, I mean, that started with an interesting behavioral contrast, and one of the questions in behavioral contrast at the time was, is contrast due to changes in reinforcement rate or changes in response rate because they were confounded? One way to unconfound them was to remove the contingency. And when I did that, all kinds of interesting things happened. And so I thought, well, I think I'll study that for a while. And I've been very lucky. I've been in a position where I've had enormous freedom to study things that I'm interested in studying.
I think it's becoming much harder for young people to have that freedom.
Oh, I think it is, yeah. I think the contingencies on getting grants and being very focused on problems that are of interest to other people because they will give you money for them. There's a big change in not just in behavior analysis, but in behavioral science generally.
Well, you picked up your first pigeon in the spring of 1963.
Yeah.
And what was it like then compared to now? How is the field different? How's it changed?
Well, it was smaller, but it wasn't. Of course, it was smaller than it is now, but it wasn't as small as it was when Skinner started. So it was in the 1960s. In the 1960s was a time of considerable growth in behavior analysis, and this program in Alabama was part of that. So one change has been that. I think that people have become, as any discipline matures, there's a lot more specialization. I think the thing that I notice the most is that behavior analysis has become much more interdisciplinary. When I was in graduate school, it was clearly psychology. Specifically it was a psychology of learning, and it was a little specific piece of that, and it's kind of grown into its own discipline. And it has grown in ways that have brought in a lot of other disciplines into the fold, as it were. And so we have, and that's a lot of that's come, I think, with application too. But even at one point at least, there was a lot of philosophical interest in it from people that were outside of psychology as such.
I think there seems to be maybe a return to that interest. People sort of rediscovering behaviorism, it seems, in various areas.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The fellow out in Arizona State, whose name Williams somebody. Anyway, his work on behaviorism, coming at it from a cognitive psychologist, it's kind of found something of value in behaviorism. And there's a philosopher that's talking here at ABBA this year about consciousness, and really is giving a very behavioral approach. I think that's one of the things that ABBA has done, is it has brought in people that we might not otherwise come in contact with, that are kindred spirits, at least, in what we're doing.
They may be shocked to find their kindred spirits with us, but
yeah, well, sometimes they're a little bit in denial of it, but
I don't mean to sound like a behaviorist.
Yeah, right.
So, as we just were talking, your career path has been very blossomed. Each part of it has blossomed from the previous part. There are no disjunctions as far as my knowledge of it is concerned. But given that, it may be hard for you to answer this next question. But what work of yours, what area of your work, do you think will have the most lasting importance for the field?
Well, I don't know. You know, Einstein once made the statement that predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. It's funny that way, because things that you think are not very important in one era, somebody else picks up on at a later time, and all of a sudden it becomes very important. An example of that is this whole thing about resurgence that's going on now, that really started with an experiment that somebody did in Fred Keller's lab in 1950, and it lay dormant for a long time, and then Robert Epstein did some stuff with it, and then it lay dormant, and now it's everywhere. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to say. The work that I'm the most pleased about, I think, is the broadly speaking, the work I've done on the response-reinforcer relation, and the different functions that it serves, and how variations in it lead to changes in behavior. So I'm very pleased about that. I also, I'm very proud of my 36 PhDs that I've turned out, and I think that I would like to think that will have some lasting impact that will carry on through at least a couple of generations as we move forward.
At one time you mentioned to me that not very many of them had gone into academia, which sort of surprised you and maybe disappointed you. Since then, apparently quite a few of them have.
Well, with great success, I might add.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's very satisfying to see that happen. I guess sometimes it just takes a while, you know, for things to catch on, and a certain amount of luck too, and it's certainly worked out that way.
A lot of luck, I think, in anybody's life, yeah. All parts of them.
Well, the other thing that I would like, not that I have done, but I would like for that little collection that I have of apparatus to have some impact, because I think that it does reflect the history of discipline, and it reflects the innovativeness and creativity and flexibility in thinking that I see as characterizing much of what we have been able to do in the last 50 or 60 years in terms of the way that we, not only the way that we think about behavior, but the way that we study it.
What do you think about the impact of the computer on that characteristic of operant work? Is it going to make it easier to be more innovative and creative, or is it going to be less likely because we don't have to make all those machines anymore because the computer does it all for us?
I think that the creativity that you see in the machinery is really a reflection of the contingencies that are operating on the builder, and I think that people are being very creative in the use of computers to achieve their goals, and not. I think the thing that's neat about it is that they're not letting the apparatus dictate what they do. And the computer, in some ways, you could argue either way, but I like to think that it's making it easier to be creative, because it allows the creation of all kinds of contingencies that weren't even imaginable.
Right.
40 years ago when I was first starting in this field.
It seems like it, and I've thought this for some time, it seems like it has the potential for a huge renaissance in studies on operant behavior, which just weren't possible, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can arrange all kinds of interlocking and interactive contingencies, almost meta contingencies, you know, in a sense of that we could talk about, but we had no way to actually do them, no way to actually study these things. And now, at least in principle, it's possible.
Just as a side point here, in my lab in North Texas, the students have arranged experimental meta-contingencies and behavioral contingencies and meta-contingencies, so, because using the computer makes it.
Yeah, and you just couldn't do that. Well, maybe you could, but it was practically restricted. Yeah.
Is there anything in your career that you would do differently if you had to do it over again?
You know, I thought a lot about that, and I've had so much freedom and pleasure out of things that I've done. It's kind of the sliding door problem, you know. You never know what would have been if you had done things differently. I certainly have no regrets about anything that I've done. I think one thing that I would do is I would have learned to speak French a lot earlier, because I think that the future of behavior analysis is international. And I think the more of us that can interact with people in their own culture and on their own cultural grounds have a much more likely impact. We're more likely to have an impact on people in those cultures. But that's a minor thing.
Case in point was Fred Keller in Brazil.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He had, and it's his impact is almost inestimable. You go down there now, and people still talk about Fred. And I think a lot of it was Fred, but certainly but certainly it was the reaching out, and part of the reaching out was the language. I don't think it's the language per se, but I think it's what the language implies. It's the important thing.
Have you been down recently to Brazil?
No, not since. I was down 2-3 years ago to Sao Paulo.
They're going strong in all areas.
Yeah.
Very nice.
One of my students is taking a postdoc in Sao Paulo in the fall.
Which
Carlos Cansado, who is Brazilian, and maybe his wife, who's also one of my students.
So now you're going to be having progeny, so to speak, in
that's right.
Brazil as well as Mexico, which you already have progeny in.
Well, Carlos was kind of a progeny himself of someone that was in Morgantown on sabbatical from Brazil. And I met Carlos through him, Sergio Sereno. So it's all kind of interlocking.
So you should be speaking Spanish, in addition to your French. What areas of the field would you like to see more work in the near or the distant future, if you want to care to predict that far?
Well, there are a lot of little problems in the experimental analysis of behavior that I think are interesting. But they're kind of specific things, I guess. I think broadly, I think two things broadly. I think conceptually, I'd like to see more work in the conceptual area. I feel like that's an area that's kind of fallen off a bit. People don't seem as interested in it, and it seems to me really important to get the conceptual analysis of this stuff down right, or whatever right means. But just to study it and to contribute to its growth. And I don't see, I mean, I teach a course in behavior theory and philosophy, and a lot of what I teach is what is Skinner. You know, because there are some developments. I don't mean to denigrate the developments, but I think it's lagged behind the other two elements in our field.
I think so too.
And the other thing I think is just the kind of stuff that you're doing in terms of looking at cultural contingencies and looking at the impact of broader contingencies and using culture in a very general sense to include any kind of organizational kind of stuff. That started, a lot of that, I don't know if it started there, but a lot of that work was done at West Virginia in the 70s. People like Kraftful and Maley and Harshbarger were very innovative, I thought, in beginning to try and apply behavior analytic concepts and more broadly than just the individual. And of course, there's a lot of back and forth about that even today and how it's been done. But I think that I'd like to. That's what I would like to see is more development in that area.
Certainly a wide open area. And of course, Don Haight there was
right. Don with his social
and
stuff. Yeah.
Well, what do you think? What do you see as the future? Do you see behavior analysis as becoming? Let me put a question in kind of either or, and then you can say none of the above or something else. But do you see behavior analysis as strengthening as a discipline in the future, or as dissipating as a discipline and kind of being taken up by a lot of other disciplines and kind of disappearing in and of itself?
It's hard to say. I guess I can see elements of both things happening. I think that I'm a little disappointed that behavioral neuroscience is not picking up more than just our methods. But I mean, this gets back to the conceptual stuff and reductionism and all those kinds of issues around what the science is going to look like and where we're going to focus things. And I think we're having trouble with that too, in terms of articulating a role for behavior analysis in a discipline that's becoming increasingly molecular and reductionistic in the broader culture. And I think that that's a little problematic for us.
Interestingly enough, it even is happening in biology. I mean, the systematists have kind of given way to the molecular biologists. I mean, very few people actually look at the whole organism when they worry about evolutionary theory. They're all looking at the genome and
Well, I thought I thought in the 80s when people got interested in foraging and those kinds of things, I thought that was going to be a real boon for our approach, but it doesn't. It really hasn't materialized in quite that way.
So you commented a minute ago on your students, and then you had 36 PhD students, I think you were speaking of, and that they've done very well. Some of them have really made some very important contributions themselves. What message would you like to tell future students that you may not have, or students of the future? What advice would you give them?
Let your data be your guide.
Can't beat that.
Well, that would be part of it, I think. I think, find, the obvious kinds of things. Find something that you're interested in, and don't waste your time doing things that really don't function as reinforcers for you. I think that in terms of learning, I think that students really need to get the conceptual foundation. They need to figure out how to think like a behavior analyst. And they need to really concentrate their work on that aspect of it. I think too often we get into the technical details because that's where the reinforcers are, whether it's learning a particular procedure or learning how to write a program and this sort of thing. And you see a lot of drift in behavior analysis and other fields because of that, because those things become reinforcing in and of themselves. So you see a lot of basic guys and gals that go off and get into computer science or something instead of sticking with behavior analysis. And I think part of it stems from, I don't know, I guess just individual differences and individual interests and histories. But I think part of getting people on the right track is just getting them conceptually oriented. And I think it's as important for applied behavior analysts as it is for basic ones, because I think too often the applied behavior analysts approach it from from a technological point of view. And it's certainly possible to do that, but I don't think that in terms of training that we do a very good job if we don't give people the conceptual foundations on which the science is built.
It seems like what happens if you don't have that, at least for many people, is they hit a wall that their technology fails, and then they go find some other conceptual framework because they think that behavior analysis has failed and they're not doing analysis.
Right. And I think that that's a real problem. That the challenge is to take difficult problems and think about them as a behavior analyst. And you have to learn how to do that, or you'll end up doing what you just said, I think. You'll end up drifting off into one thing and the other. And a lot of it has to do with just having the skills and tools to do that with, and that's why I think in terms of students that it's very important that they learn the foundation, the kind of the epistemological basis for behavior analysis early on.
You see Skinner's often been talked about his radical behaviorist philosophy as basically from the epistemological standpoint. It really isn't epistemology, it's how do we know,
Right.
It's what it's all about. But what did he have to say about ontology? Do you have any sense of that? What was his kind of position, if there was one?
Ontology, like the basis of knowledge? Or
kind of like answering the question, what exists? What exists? What is? I think, in a sense, he answered that by saying the subject matter being behavior. Seems like, in a sense, he answered that question. Behavior exists.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, under what conditions does it change? And how does it come to exist?
Yeah.
Questions like that.
I don't have an answer for that question.
Okay, it's something I've been thinking about, so I thought I'd just see what you thought.
I haven't really thought about it, actually, in terms of... I keep going back to pragmatism, and his big shift to pragmatism and taking a very pragmatic approach to things that exist in terms of useful working and that sort of thing. But
yeah, if you can't make it work, then maybe it doesn't exist, right? So.
Well, it's a tough question, is to say what existence is and what it means.
Thank you very much. You made me think some more about that. Do you have anything else you'd like to add for students in the future?
I don't know. Just really enjoy what you do. I think that's the main message. Is you have to find that part of behavior analysis that gives you satisfaction, and then pursue it.
When we were interviewing people for job position last year, one of the questions that the faculty came up with to ask the interviewees was, what is your behavioral hobby? You have your field of expertise and what you're doing, but what do you do that's behavioral that's kind of on the side? Do you have a behavioral hobby? I know what yours is, I think.
Yeah, it's got to be running.
Are you still doing that?
I still do it, and I still count it every day.
Good for you.
I have records going back to 1975.
Wow. I have one other question to ask you of a personal nature, and that is, one time I recall that when you went on trips, you wrote down all the restaurants you went to and all the places you went. Are you still doing that? Yeah. You are a consistent man.
Well, I've now turned to emails to my family, and when I go on a trip, I don't do it every day, but I always send rather detailed emails, and I keep the record that way.
It's a great way to do it.
Yeah.
Share it as well as keep a record of it.
Yeah. And I have to say, it's been much of the traveling that I've been able to do has been because of behavior analysis, and it's another benefit to me to be able to do that and to to see how other people are doing behavior analysis and to have some impact on that.
Are you going to the international conference in Spain?
Probably not, because I'm going to Japan for 5 weeks
Ooh,
to do research with a colleague.
that's exciting.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for
Well, thank
talking
you.
to us about your past and
It's
your
been
future.
great. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.